when we left off, we have next on the agenda Bill 185 with Senator Dennis Rodriguez. You're acknowledged on Bill 185.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Madam Speaker, fellow colleagues. Madam Speaker, move to place Bill 185-33 as substituted by the author on third reading. Be allowed to discuss the bill.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, landowner rights and government land taking issues remain among our most contentious and unresolved issues. The history and practice of land taking by the federal government has resulted in a mindset wherein the past practices are deemed contrary to democratic principles and never again to be tolerated. Likewise, land takings by the government of Guam are resulting in another untenable situation, also deserving of a fair resolution. The government of Guam is now the entity expropriating the property, ostensibly for the public's benefit, but it has done so in far too many instances without notification and thereby in effect denying the landowner the opportunity to seek timely, just compensation in accordance with the Organic Act of Guam and the laws of Guam. Former Vice Speaker Ted Nelson began an effort over 20 years ago in 1994, Madam Speaker, pursuant to Public Law 22-33, seeking to resolve the government's conduct of takings through inverse condemnation from 1950 through July 1st, 1994, by way of the identification of affected properties. It mandated the compiling of report on all inverse condemnations so as to properly identify, categorize, and quantify the actual number of takings. This listing was to be utilized to facilitate the claims of the claimant's ability to institute an action for inverse condemnation, but the mandate has been continuously ignored. Further, the act was intended to tighten the process by which the government henceforth exercised takings and by which claimants for subsequent takings after July 1994 could seek just compensation by way of due process. Compounding the problem, many landowners remain unaware that an inverse condemnation taking had occurred relative to their property until it was too late. Inadvertently contributing to their demise, Public Law 22-73 also provided for a 4-year statute of limitation to institute an action for taking subsequent to July 1st, 1994. So for most potential claimants, time has run out without their ever knowing the clock was ticking. Consequently, the government keeps the land at no cost, sheltered under the statute and the argument that the landowner failed to timely file. Notwithstanding this position by the government, it can be a legitimate argument that the landowner remained unaware of the inverse condemnation and the need to file timely, in great part directly due to the government's failure to compile the inverse condemnation report. Simultaneously, and quite to the contrary, Public Law 22-73 preserves and keeps open the opportunity to institute an action for the taking, which occurred prior to July 1st, 1994, to this day in 2015. The failure to compile the pre-1994 report and the additional listing of subsequent takings in such a report has impeded both categories of landowners who, by and large, lack the financial and procedural ability to proceed without assistance from the government utilizing their land for public benefit purposes. Our government has neither adequately addressed the land takings prior to July 1st, 1994 by way of compiling the mandated report, nor has it properly and consistently conducted subsequent takings as provided pursuant to this Public Law 22-73. If anything, Madam Speaker, the government has seriously exacerbated the situation, significantly increasing its liability. The very reason we find ourselves here today discussing Bill 185-33 is that the government of Guam has failed to fulfill the mandates of Public Law 22-73 as enacted over 20 years ago in 1994. It is patently unfair that our government's failure to comply with the law, further placing the landowner at a disadvantage, cannot be used as an argument by the landowner in support of justifying his purported failure to file timely. In the consideration of Bill 185-33, Madam Speaker, we must carefully keep in mind the specific intent and focus of this legislation solely pertains to remedy the past unresolved land takings initiated by our government, directly pursuant to which the public has collectively benefited. Bill 185 is primarily intended to, number one, mandate that all agencies and instrumentalities of the government determine whether any land in its inventory, possession, or which is being utilized for public purposes has been properly acquired by due process and compensation has been provided. This would remove or greatly alleviate a great portion of the onerous burden of perfecting a claim from being solely borne by the landowners. Number two, Madam Speaker, it will move forward the date for the filing of a claim for compensation for 5 years from the date of enactment of this act or until 2021, whichever is later, without which numerous outstanding claims for land takings will be precluded, and to mandate that the agencies pay the cost for investigating and confirming such claims. This has been an otherwise unduly onerous and expensive burden to be performed by a landowner seeking compensation for an action initiated by our government. Number three, with the validation or confirmation of an inverse condemnation taking, the landowner would then be notified by the agency of his or her right to institute an action for inverse condemnation. The landowner and government can then more readily move forward with the process of determining true market value and appropriate compensation. This process would place a reasonable portion of the burden of validating or confirming a claim upon compensation. Number four, provides for the administrative adjudication of a claim by an agency to which a validated claim was filed and sets performance timelines by which the agency to which the claim was filed shall respond to the claim and determine fair market value and the compensation due the landowners, inclusive of interest. Number five, Madam Speaker, it establishes a fifth division in the Superior Court of Guam for a land division, a court of record intended to expedite judicial process for claims for government taking and condemnation within the Superior Court of Guam. The Act recognizes that each land taking case is different, and the mandate is provided by the Act to preclude a broad-based class action suit without landowner consent, thereby assuring there is individual consideration of the unique parcels affected unless otherwise deemed appropriate by the court. Number six, establishes a land claims compensation fund which will be utilized solely to pay settlements, in whole or in part, to landowners who have had their property taken by the government of Guam for public purposes. If passed, our government will be mandated to direct funds from other sources into this fund beginning in fiscal year 2017. Madam Speaker, certainly there is a very significant cost involved in addressing this issue. Just as with any other legitimate public debt we have accrued and ultimately paid upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars to extinguish. Just because it will in all likelihood be expensive, Madam Speaker, does not make it any less necessary, nor does it justify not addressing this very important issue. Because of the collective beneficial outcome derived from the property taken for public purposes, we cannot allow the burden realized to be placed solely upon the backs of a few. This is a collective public burden, the cost of which must be shared equally. It is imperative that the current and future executive branch administration makes every effort to allocate funds to extinguish this debt, The longer we take to address this financial burden will result in an increase of the amount owed to our landowners. As to the concerns that Bill 185-33 will open up a can of worms, Madam Speaker, all I can say is that that would be better than our continuing to kick the can down the road in the hope that someone else will someday address this important issue. Are we to now knowingly going down the road of denying justice to our people over something we have historically found unacceptable just because it is we who are this time the source of the injustice? Madam Speaker, justice delayed is justice denied. I respectfully encourage our colleagues, Madam Speaker, to support this measure. We know that this measure, this initiative has been started over 20 years ago. And I believe, a lot of people believe, it's that, that big elephant in the room that is really putting that fear in us, that we know that it's going to cost a lot of money to be able to extinguish this debt and to resolve this issue. The way we have brought this initiative forward this time, Madam Speaker, with you as a co-sponsor, Senator Frank Uggan Jr., Senator Rory Spicio, Senator Tommy Morrison, Senator Tony Atta, and Senator Brant McCready, Madam Speaker, is really an approach that, that we believe would address this issue in a way that's responsible. It recognizes the fact that we need to make good of this obligation, and it starts to, with fiscal year 2017, set aside the funds that are necessary. And because we are prohibiting any class action lawsuit with this, because we know the land issues are very unique and need to be considered separately, there's possibly a way that we can really kind of make these payments as we go along, as the agencies and as the courts have determined truly what is owed to our people. Another component, another amendment that we have included, Madam Speaker, is in an effort to really look within our available resources now, or the potential resources, is we included an amendment that the payment in lieu of taxes, which was known as the pilot. We know that this pilot has been in the books for many, many years. In 2011, when Governor Calvo administration took office, this was one of the first items that we know they were pursuing. And so there was some sort of negotiation and settlement that may have been reached by the government and at least GPA. And so we haven't had the opportunity to determine whether a payment has indeed been made. But what we're proposing here is that once that moves forward, any payment that the utilities, GPA, I believe, the port and the airport, who are covered under the pilot, that those funds now be deposited into the land claims fund. And so it's these types of initiatives, Madam Speaker, and really relying on everyone else here in this body to be able to look for ways, look for resources on how we could make good on this obligation we need to our landowners. And so I look forward to the discussion on this, Madam Speaker. I want to just state for the record that the courts have responded positively to this measure, as it involves creating a court, a Fifth Division Court of Record. We know that based on the budget they received for this fiscal year, that they would be able to handle this, to handle what it is we are requesting that they do in terms of inverse condemnation and land taking. So again, I ask my colleagues for their support. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
You're very welcome, Senator Rodriguez. Are there anyone wishing to speak on the main motion on Bill 185-33 COR? Anyone? Senator Frank Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I believe the primary sponsor of the legislation, has already eloquently stated the provisions contained in Bill 185-33. You know, Madam Speaker, he also alluded to a possibility or a tremendous cost that could be affiliated with this. But, Madam Speaker, with all due respect to trying to identify that, I think the first and foremost process is exactly what is provided in this piece of legislation. Let us get the government entities to be able to partner, to be able to reach out to the private landowners of whom they have taken property away for either the past 5 years, the past 20 years, the past 30 years, and identify those properties. Because if they are not under the title ownership of the government of Guam, then these families continue to retain ownership and in some cases continue to pay taxes on those properties. A couple of things, Madam Speaker, as it relates to this. First and foremost, I believe I shared this similar story or the same story in previous sessions where a gentleman with the assistance of the former chair of our good friend Speaker Pangilinan, after 35 years, he was able to settle the use of his private property. He went through the office of the Attorney General and they negotiated a price tag of $25,000. When he came to the public hearing, he said, I just want to close the loop on this particular issue. He said, I don't want to take the property back because he recognized that this gentleman, older gentleman, mind you, recognized that the property was being utilized for public benefit. He said, I just want to close the loop on this and to receive something in exchange for the property. Well, for his property, he was given $25,000. That's the negotiated arrangement between himself, the property owner, as well as the Office of the Attorney General. Albeit after 35 years. Madam Speaker, it's time that we allowed the government to incorporate a process. I know the sponsor alluded to legislation that was passed about 20 plus years ago and that has not necessarily been effectuated. But this would create a process so that in fact the government can be able to identify these parcels of property that belong to private landowners and identify them initially so that at least we can press forward in terms of not only recognizing that obligation of the government of Guam, that if we are going to extract property or take property away from private landowners, we definitely need to reach out and ensure that they are either properly compensated or that they voluntarily gift that property to the government of Guam and to the people of Guam for public benefit. So there are different processes that would be required by this, and I believe that it ultimately will settle some of these outstanding arrangements in which the government, by virtue of public need, had to go in there in many cases. I'm not going to justify all cases, but in many cases had to go into private property and use it directly for public benefit. But unfortunately, they had forgone the process of working with the private landowners and settling the transfer of the title of that property. Another example, Madam Speaker, that immediately comes to mind is Route 4, albeit it's in front of my home roadway, Route 4 going down to the Luzon landfill. I know that the oversight chair for DPW had looked at that and had inquired on a few occasions, why is it that the government of Guam, and I hope he can correct me if I misstate his presentation, but why is it that the government of Guam is not able to expand or to upgrade some of the roadways along Route 4 going down to Malolo and on into the Luzon landfill? And one thing that was very obvious and that was reported back by our government officials, in particular DPW, is that a good stretch of that Route 4 from Jonya all the way down to Inalahan, Madam Speaker, were still registered in private landowners' ownership. That's why the government of Guam is not able to utilize federal highway funds to be able to either refurbish, upgrade, or expand that particular roadway down to the Luzon landfill. And we know that that roadway is already heavily used by all of these trucks that haul trash and debris down to the Luzon landfill, and it definitely is in need of upgrade and expansion for the benefit of the entire island community, in addition to our southern residents. So, Madam Speaker, this would identify those strips of roadway that are still under the ownership of private landowners and allow the government of Guam to be able to either work with the private landowners, work out an arrangement, and I'm not leaving out the possibility that some of these families, Madam Speaker, may want to gift these parcels of property to the government of Guam to continue to be used for public benefit. But in the same token, some of these private landowners may want compensation. And we owe it to them that we identify exactly which parcels of property are not under the title ownership of the government of Guam, and be able to work out that arrangement so that these private landowners can be made whole and they can ultimately transfer that property in title, fee simple, over to the government of Guam, so that we can, in the example of Route 4, be able to upgrade, refurbish, or expand that particular roadway for the benefit of the entire island community and our people in the South. Two examples, Madam Speaker. The one extreme, a family member, property owner, waited 35 years to settle the use of his property, unauthorized use of his property by the government of Guam for public benefit, and he negotiated a $25,000 arrangement. The other extreme is that we have properties out there in which the government of Guam continues to use for public benefit. We need to identify that. Bill 185-33 allows for a process to be created, allows for the process to be expedited through a court system, so that in fact not only the recognition of these properties of private landowners can be identified, but the arrangement can be worked out either through the government of Guam agencies with the private landowners, or through the judiciary, the judicial system, so that ultimately the government of Guam can have full ownership and title of these properties. So I encourage our colleagues, Madam Speaker, to look at this. Yes, it's going to be a hefty price tag, because this is not the first time that this piece of legislation has been introduced. But the first part of this entire process is working with the government of Guam agencies, working with the private landowners, identifying these parcels of property, and then moving to the next phase of having the government of Guam negotiate with the family owners and eventually take it under government ownership. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
You're welcome, Senator Agan. On the main motion, Senator Mike Nicholas, you're recognized. Anyone else wishing to speak? Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is a very complex piece of legislation that has several major implications for adjudication of land claims, the establishment of a land court, etc. And as I read through the bill, I can see that the intent is to make sure that those individuals who had property taken by the government are afforded justice, regardless of whether or not their property was taken beyond the statute of limitations. I'm okay with that. My concern is that some of the way the language is structured opens the door for the government to be liable for something that they may not necessarily they may not necessarily need to be liable for. As an example, as the retiring speaker mentioned, some properties were afforded due process and granted to the government for use without any compensation provided. And the way some of the language is written in this bill is that if there was no just compensation for the property, all of a sudden the government's going to have to pay you. Even if, you know, your great-grandfather might have gifted it to the government for use for an easement or for a road to get into the family property, all of a sudden now, because there's no just compensation specifically, then the government will be liable for something that it was not originally liable for, just by virtue of us passing this bill. And if you'll allow me to give an example. On page 4, lines 11 through 17, particularly lines 16 and 17. It talks about the agencies, departments, authorities, and instrumentalities of the government of Guam shall determine whether or not any land in its inventory, possession, or which is being utilized by it for public purposes has been properly acquired from a private landowner by due process, and that just compensation has been provided and accepted. Now, for me, Madam Speaker, the way this should read is we should strike through the word properly and replace it with the word legally. And then we should say that the agency shall determine if the property was legally acquired from a private landowner with due process, period. Because whether or not there was compensation depends entirely upon which the due process matter was resolved. Because in due process, again, somebody may have said, you know what, go ahead and take this strip of land for the easement to the government to access the family property without any compensation. Just go ahead and take it because we need you. The government's going to pave the road. They're going to put in the telephone poles. We're going to be able to access the land for the kids. And so go ahead, government, go ahead and take that road for us to be able to access the property. There may have been due process there, Madam Speaker, and there may not have been any compensation. But there may have been an understanding from the landowner that, hey, you know what, yeah, go ahead because I need to be able to have the access into the rest of the properties. But by requiring in this language that just compensation has been provided and accepted, all of a sudden we're going to go back and everybody can renege on those arrangements. Case in point, Madam Speaker, I don't quite know my family property in Talafofo. I know there's a road that goes into there from the main road. I don't quite know who owns that strip of road going into my family area inside of Lucas. But if that strip of road was owned by my great-grandfather's brother, for example, and they said, you know what, go ahead and use that for easement for the San Nicolas clan to be able to access all their land, now because it requires that just compensation has been provided and accepted, they can go back and say, oh, but you never compensated me for that road. Even if that road was offered to the government and the government invested in the infrastructure for them to be able to access the property. So that being an example, Madam Speaker, we need to go back into this bill and carefully make sure that the agencies or whoever's responsible for going back and looking at these things is going to go back and look to make sure due process was afforded. If due process was not, then they got to compensate. But if due process was afforded and they offered up the property in lieu of compensation because the government was going to do its part to put the infrastructure in, or for whatever reason, then they shouldn't be able, they really should not be able to go back and say, you owe me for that land. You get what I'm saying? So, and that's throughout the bill. That's just that one section. You see it again in section B. The words "and just compensation" on line 21, that should be taken out. If there's a judicial proceeding was conducted whereby due process was accorded the landowner, that's it.
Senator Mike, did you want to make any amendment on section A first?
I'm going to go through the bill to kind of point out how that's throughout the language, and then maybe because it's kind of prevalent throughout the bill, I may ask for a recess so I can have the time to really go through surgically and find all of those examples. But we have it there on section B. On section C, line 25, where it says has not been compensated, we should probably replace that with was not afforded due process. And then on page 5, at the end of line 4, we should add without due process. So there's just multiple examples there, Madam Speaker, and I kind of wanted to point that out because I understand the intent of the bill. The intent of the bill is to allow for people who had their land unjustly taken to be afforded the compensation that's due to them regardless of whether or not it's lapsed the statute. It's those examples of those whose properties were justly surrendered to the government without the compensation, because this kind of turns it around and makes the government possibly liable to pay for something that it originally had no liability for. So I would like to request a recess, Madam Speaker, and I'm not quite sure how long it may take. Perhaps a set aside may be in order, but I would like to work with some of my colleagues to kind of comb through this on a recess.
We're going to go ahead and take a recess.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Half a day, this legislature is back from recess. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand on Bill 185, there were some questions that were asked, and I know that Senator Mike St. Nicholas was looking at doing some amendments. So I'm going to go ahead and address Senator Dennis at this time.
Okay.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, what I'll do is request that we set 185 aside and then give our colleagues who do have some concerns an opportunity to go in and look at what they would like addressed, and then we come back either tomorrow or on Thursday to be able to address this measure.
Okay, thank you very much. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and call recess till 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.